Her name was Ada Kowalski. She lived in a company house in Scotts Run, West Virginia. The year was 1932. Her husband worked the coal seam when the mine ran, which by then was 2, sometimes 3 days a week. He was paid partly in cash and partly in scrip, company money, good only at the company store, worth nothing anywhere else. The rent on the house was deducted before he ever saw a dollar. The store prices ran higher than any store in town, and still, 6 children ate supper every night. She did not have a bank account. She did not have a garden plot bigger than a bedsheet. She had a system, passed down from a mother who had survived a mine strike, and a set of habits built specifically for a kind of poverty that was designed, deliberately, by the company that owned the house she lived in. Coal country in the 1930s was a different kind of hard than the rest of the Depression. The company owned the house. The company owned the store. The company set the wage and controlled the currency. A family here was not just fighting a bad economy. It was fighting a system built to keep it exactly where it stood. Number 9 on this list beat the company store at its own game, without anyone catching on for years. Number 4 kept children fed on a food most families threw straight into the trash. And number 1, the rule mining families guarded above all others, is the same principle that separates a family that owes nothing from a family that owes everything. These were not clever housewives making do. These were strategists operating inside a rigged economy and finding every seam of daylight it had left uncovered. Hit subscribe. Let's count down the 25 forgotten survival tricks coal mining families used during the Great Depression.
Coal company towns were not built for gardening. The good land belonged to the mine. What was left for the miners was often a strip of yard barely wider than the house itself, sometimes laid over ground poisoned by decades of coal dust and slag runoff. Families planted anyway. They hauled in topsoil, a bucket at a time, from creek banks and hollows outside town, built raised beds out of scrap lumber, and coaxed beans, cabbage, and potatoes out of ground the company had never intended to feed anyone. A garden the size of a large table, tended with total discipline, could produce 60 to 80 pounds of vegetables across a season. That was food the company store never touched and never priced. The company owned the house. It did not own what grew beside it.
Company scrip could only be spent at the company store, and the company store's prices ran anywhere from 10 to 20% above town prices. Families who needed real cash for a doctor, for a debt to a relative, for anything the company store didn't sell, found ways to convert it. A miner might trade scrip to a traveling peddler at a discount, taking 80 cents on the dollar in real money rather than a full dollar he couldn't spend outside company lines. Others traded scrip directly with off-shift workers from other camps who had the opposite problem. It was a loss on paper. It was survival in practice. A family that never converted a cent of scrip was a family entirely at the mercy of one store's prices, with no way to reach a doctor, a lawyer, or a bus ticket out. The 80 cents that left the table bought freedom the full dollar never could. The company store extended credit against a miner's future pay, and it was in the store's interest to let that debt grow, because a family that owed the company money could not easily leave. Wise wives fought this specifically. They tracked every purchase against the ledger themselves in a notebook at home, matching it line for line against what the store clerk wrote down. When a discrepancy appeared, and it often did, always in the store's favor, she brought her own numbers to the counter and made the clerk correct it in front of her. A family that checked the ledger every week rarely fell into the debt trap that kept so many mining families tied to a company town for a decade past when they wanted to leave. The company counted on families not checking. The families who checked kept a door open that the company would have preferred stayed shut. An unmarried miner needed a place to sleep and someone to cook for him, and he was willing to pay for both. Families with a spare room, even a converted porch or a curtained-off corner, took in a boarder. He paid weekly, in cash when possible, for a bed and 2 meals a day. One boarder's payment could cover a third of a family's total food costs for the month. The extra cooking was more labor for the wife, but it was labor that converted directly into cash the company store couldn't touch and couldn't inflate. A spare room was not empty space, it was unclaimed income, waiting for someone to walk through the door and fill it.
The hills around a coal camp, unlike the yard beside the house, belonged to no one in particular. Families who knew the land foraged it hard. Poke greens in spring, wild onions, blackberries in July, walnuts and hickory nuts in fall, mushrooms after rain. A woman who knew exactly where the ramps came up in April had a source of fresh greens the company store didn't sell and couldn't price. This knowledge was taught to children early and deliberately. Which plants fed you, which ones you left alone, which hollow held berries a full week before the one 2 ridges over. A family with 3 foraging children effectively had 3 more grocery runs a week, all of them free. The mountain did not answer to the coal company. It fed whoever knew how to ask. Coal was the one thing a mining family was never short of. Miners were often allowed to take home a certain allotment of scrap coal, or picked it directly from the slag heap, where the poorer quality pieces were discarded. But even free coal required skill to burn efficiently, and matches cost money that mattered. Women taught their children to build a fire that caught on the first strike, kindling arranged in a precise teepee, the smallest slivers of wood on the bottom, coal added only once the wood was fully caught. A family that wasted matches, that needed 3 or 4 strikes to get a fire going, was spending real cash on something a careful hand could do for free with 1. Over a winter, the difference between a 1-match household and a 4-match household was measured in actual dollars. Coal was free. The match was not. The mothers who mastered the fire never let the free thing get wasted for lack of care with the thing that cost money. A doctor's visit in a coal camp could cost a day's wages or more, and mine company doctors, where they existed, were often distrusted, seen as more loyal to the company than the patient. Mining families relied heavily on home remedies passed down through generations: mustard plasters for chest congestion, onion syrup for coughs, camphor rubs, willow bark tea for fever and pain. These were not superstition dressed as medicine. Many had real pharmacological basis. Willow bark contains the same compound later synthesized into aspirin. A mother who knew which remedy matched which symptom and who could accurately judge when a case had moved beyond home care into real danger saved her family money on every illness that didn't need to become a bill. She was not avoiding the doctor out of stubbornness. She was avoiding a debt the family could not afford, for as long as it was safe to avoid it. Heating enough water for a full laundry day took coal, took time, and took a fire that had to be tended the entire day. Neighboring wives in company housing rows often shared the labor and the fuel. One big fire, one set of heated wash water, used in sequence by 3 or 4 households before it cooled. The coal cost was split. The labor of hauling and heating water was divided across more hands. A woman doing laundry alone spent a full fuel ration on her family's clothes alone. A woman doing laundry with her row of neighbors got the same clean clothes for a quarter of the coal. The company had built the houses close together to pack in workers efficiently. The wives used that same closeness to cut their costs the same way. Traveling peddlers, often immigrants themselves, working outside the company's control, came through mining camps, selling goods the company store didn't carry, at prices the company store couldn't match, because the peddler had no company rent to cover and no captive customer base to exploit. Fabric, tools, tin goods, sometimes fresh produce from outside the valley. Families who built a relationship with a reliable peddler had access to a second economy entirely outside company control, one where prices moved with actual supply and demand instead of a company ledger designed to keep miners in debt. A woman who saved her real cash specifically for the peddler's visits, rather than spending small amounts at the company store all week, got more for every dollar she had. The company store had no competition inside camp limits.
The peddler was the only competition that ever showed up, and the families who used him kept the company store honest by comparison, one purchase at a time. Canning jars cost money, and a full season's canning required dozens of them. Mining families without the cash to buy a full set borrowed, traded, and pooled jars with neighbors and relatives. One family canning tomatoes lent their extra jars to a family canning green beans 2 weeks later and got them back filled with beans in exchange. This wasn't charity. It was a rotating inventory system that let 3 or 4 families can a full season's worth of food using perhaps half the total jars they'd have needed if each family bought its own complete set. A jar that sat empty on a shelf was money doing nothing. A jar that moved from kitchen to kitchen through a whole canning season did the work of 3 jars for the price of 1. Everything that came from the company store in a sack, flour, sugar, cornmeal, chicken feed, left an empty sack behind, and that sack had value. Washed and cut, it became dish towels, patches, diaper cloth, and eventually, stitched together in enough quantity, children's clothing, the same way it did on farms across the country. In a company town where every other purchase funneled money back to the same store, the sack was one of the only things a family got essentially for free, already paid for as packaging on something they needed anyway. Wasting it was wasting money twice. The company sold the flour. It never thought to charge for the sack. The families made sure that oversight counted for something.
A cow needed pasture that company housing rarely provided. A goat needed almost none. Goats could graze rough, marginal ground, slag edges, hillsides, the strip along a rail line that a cow would starve on. A single milk goat, kept behind even the smallest company house, produced enough milk for a family's daily needs at a fraction of the feed cost of a cow. Milk from the company store, if it was available at all, was priced the way everything else in the store was priced, high and rising. A family with a goat never paid that price. She fed her children a staple the company would otherwise have controlled entirely, using an animal small enough to fit in a strip of yard the size of a garden bed. The goat did not care that the ground was poor. Neither did the milk it produced.
Here is what the decade actually looked like in coal country. By 1932, an estimated 40% of the nation's coal miners were unemployed, and many of the rest worked reduced schedules of 2 or 3 days a week. In parts of West Virginia and Kentucky, average family income in mining communities fell below $300 a year, well under $1 a day for households of 5 or 6. An estimated 1 in 4 coal camp children in the worst-hit counties showed signs of malnutrition by 1932, according to relief workers who documented conditions for federal reports. The mines cut wages. The company stores did not cut prices. Between those two facts sat a family that had to close the gap using nothing but skill, patience, and land that technically belonged to somebody else. They did not close the gap with luck. They closed it 1 goat, 1 jar, 1 checked ledger line at a time.
During strikes, and coal country saw many in the early 1930s, regular wages stopped entirely, sometimes for months. Union halls and strike committees organized communal kitchens, pooling whatever food families could contribute, cooking it together in enormous shared pots, and distributing it to every family involved in the strike, regardless of what they'd been able to bring. A family with nothing left to contribute still ate because the system was built on solidarity rather than individual balance. A family with a surplus contributed it, knowing that next month the situation might reverse entirely. This was not charity in the traditional sense. It was collective insurance, built and run by the miners themselves, in a system where no company-run alternative would have offered the same protection.
Cash, real cash outside the scrip system, was rare enough that families found every possible way to generate a little of it. Berries picked wild in the hills cost nothing to gather. Sold in tin buckets to passing motorists on the main road out of the valley, or to families in nearby towns without hillside access of their own, they became one of the only reliable sources of actual currency a family without a second wage earner could access. A good afternoon of picking, sold well, might bring in 15 or 20 cents. Not much, but money that belonged entirely outside the company's control, spendable anywhere, on anything. It was a child's task, usually, but the cash it produced went straight into the family reserve, and the mothers who organized berry season around their children's afternoons understood exactly what that reserve was worth. With mine work cut to a few days a week, many miners' wives took in work of their own. Ironing for wealthier families in the county seat, sewing repairs, washing laundry for boarding houses. This income was often small, a few dollars a week, but it was steady in a way mine wages during the Depression frequently were not. A family with two income sources, even if one was tiny and irregular, weathered a mine shutdown far better than a family relying entirely on a husband's uncertain shift schedule. The second income didn't need to be large, it needed to exist, and it needed to keep existing when the mine whistle didn't blow. She was not just running a household, she was running the family's second business, and it was often the one that kept the lights on when the first one didn't. Kerosene, coal oil as it was called in the camps, cost money the company store priced like everything else. Families rationed lamp use with real precision. One lamp lit per room the family actually occupied at a time, turned down as low as the light could go while still being usable, extinguished the moment the room emptied. Children did homework clustered around a single lamp rather than each having their own light. Sewing and mending happened by that same shared flame. A household that managed its coal oil carefully might make a can that a careless household burned through in half the time. Darkness came free. Light cost money. The families who survived best were the ones who used exactly as much light as the task required and not one drop more.
Company store scales were not always honest, and mining families, over years of shopping at the only store available to them, learned to watch. A woman who brought her own small scale from home, or who simply knew from long experience roughly what a pound of flour should look like in the sack, caught shortages the store might otherwise have gotten away with for years. When she caught one, she said so, calmly and specifically, and asked for the difference to be made up. Clerks who knew a woman checked her weights learned to weigh honestly for her specifically, because the alternative was a scene at the counter that cost the store more in reputation than the shortage was worth. The company controlled the store. It did not control whether a customer was paying attention. The attentive ones got what they'd actually paid for. Not every company house had its own reliable water source, and hauling water was labor, which meant it had a cost, even when no cash changed hands. Families organized water hauling the same way they organized wash day, a rotation, often run by the children of several households together, that spread the labor of keeping every home's water barrel full across more hands than any one family could spare. A family that hauled its own water alone every day lost hours of labor that could have gone toward gardening, mending, or the paid work that actually brought in cash. A family inside a hauling rotation lost only its share. Water was free at the pump. What was not free was the time it took to carry it home. The rotation was where the real savings lived. A family that could afford to cure and smoke a single ham in the fall sometimes bought cheap from a farming family outside the coal camp, sometimes raised themselves if the yard allowed it, treated it as a resource to be measured out over months, not eaten in a week. Thin slices flavored a pot of beans on Monday. The bone, saved separately, went into soup on Thursday. A sliver, fried crisp, seasoned an entire pan of greens on Sunday. One properly cured and carefully rationed ham could season and flavor a family's meals for 2 to 3 months. The meat itself was almost a spice by the end, used for the flavor it lent to everything else, not as a meal on its own. It hung in the smokehouse like a clock, counting down slowly. And the family that made it last longest had simply learned to want less from it at any given meal. A miner's boots took brutal punishment underground and wore out fast, and a new pair from the company store was one of the more expensive single purchases a family faced. Men who could resole and patch their own boots using scraps of leather traded or bought cheaply kept a single pair working for 2 or 3 times as long as a pair left to wear out naturally. This skill was passed father to son as deliberately as any trade taught underground. A family that resold instead of replaced kept real money out of the company's hands, purchase after purchase, year after year. The boots went back underground the next morning, looking rough. They still worked. That was the only thing that mattered.
Some camps had an informal barter board, a board outside the store or the union hall where families pinned notices of what they had to trade and what they needed. A family with surplus eggs pinned a note. A family needing shoe repair pinned another. The board matched need to surplus across the whole camp far faster than word of mouth alone could manage. This turned an entire company town's worth of small surpluses, extra milk, a spare tool, a skill with a sewing needle, into a functioning marketplace that required no cash, no company involvement, and no debt to anyone but a neighbor. It was, in effect, a want ad section for a town the company never intended to have its own economy. The families built one anyway, nail by nail, on a board by the road. The cheapest cuts available anywhere near a coal camp were the parts wealthier households wouldn't touch: pig's feet, chitterlings, neck bones, jowl. Mining families, drawing on both Appalachian and immigrant cooking traditions that had never treated these cuts as inferior, turned them into some of the most flavorful dishes on the table. Pig's feet, simmered for hours with vinegar and pepper, or pickled outright. Neck bones, stewed with greens until the meat fell from them. These cuts cost a fraction of any roast or steak, and, cooked correctly, delivered more flavor per penny than nearly anything else in the store. A family that knew how to cook the parts other families threw away ate as well, and sometimes better than, families spending 3 times as much. What the company store priced as scrap, a mining kitchen turned into Sunday dinner.
Every trick on this list served one larger, often unspoken purpose. Some families were saving, dollar by scarce dollar, toward the day they could leave the company town entirely, pay off whatever they owed the store, and move somewhere a wage wasn't paid in company scrip, and a house wasn't owned by the same hand that owned the mine. This fund was hidden more carefully than any other money in the house because it represented the family's entire leverage against a system designed to keep them exactly where they were. A wife who controlled this fund controlled the family's one real path out, and she guarded it accordingly. Not every family made it out. The families who did almost always credited one thing: a fund nobody but her ever touched, growing slowly under a floorboard, one skipped purchase at a time. The most forward-looking families in coal country did not just teach their children how to can vegetables or resole a boot. They explained why. They showed children the company ledger and explained how debt was used to keep families tied to the town. They explained scrip and cash and the real difference between them. They explained why a garden mattered, even on poisoned ground. Children raised this way left the coal camps, when they eventually did leave, understanding the economic system they'd grown up inside. Not just the individual survival tricks, but the structure those tricks were built to resist. That understanding proved, for many, more valuable over a lifetime than any single skill on this list. A trick fed a family for a week. Understanding the system fed a family's judgment for a generation. This was the rule that outranked every other rule on this list. Every trick, the garden, the goat, the border, the checked ledger, the hidden fund, existed in service of a single relentless priority: keep the family's debt to the company as close to zero as it was humanly possible to keep it. A family in debt to the company store could not leave. Wages were garnished before they were paid. Decisions about work, about moving, about a child's future, all narrowed to whatever the company allowed a family still owing it money to consider. A family with no debt, even a family that was desperately poor by any outside measure, retained something the indebted family did not: the ability to say no. and to walk away if it ever needed to. Every dollar saved through every trick on this list flowed toward that single goal. Not comfort, not even most months enough food. Freedom from owing anyone anything they hadn't chosen to owe. She counted the ledger every week not because
These 25 tricks were not the improvisations of the desperate. They were a coordinated, generational strategy for surviving an economy deliberately built to keep working families dependent. The garden beside the poisoned yard, the goat on the slag hillside, the ledger checked line by line. None of it was incidental. All of it pointed toward the same door out. Some families made it through that door. Others held the line for a generation until the mines finally offered something closer to a fair wage. Either way, they did it using knowledge that has almost entirely vanished from how we think about hard times today. If this list gave you something worth remembering, subscribe. The next hardest era in American history is still waiting to be counted down.